This is the International AQA certificate for GCSE Biology, and today we're looking at adaptations. For all organisms to survive, whether it be plants or animals, in whatever habitat they happen to live in, they need to be suitably adapted to that. They require certain resources, whether that be food, shelter, any of those sorts of things, and they have to therefore be suitably adapted to obtain all of those. So any specific features that an organism may have is described as being an adaptation, and therefore all the different range of plants and organisms that we know exist have all got specialist adaptations to make them best suited to live within their environment and obtain those resources. And what you often get asked in exam questions is to look at an example of any description of organism that they might give you and suggest some adaptations it might have and how those are enabling it to be best suited to living in whichever environment that it does. So in order to do that, we can have a little look at a few examples. Here is obviously an example of polar regions and the snow and the ice, and a polar bear would be an organism that would live there. Key adaptations of this are the obvious big white coat, giving it not only camouflage, so it can hunt prey more successfully, but it has a thick fur to keep it warm, obviously. Other things that you must be able to describe, which we'll look at in more detail in a moment, are its large, or sort of rather small surface area to volume ratio, which we'll come back to. Big teeth, big claws for getting through the ice, and so on and so forth. Conversely, we might go to a desert region. Clearly in the background you can see lots of cacti that live here, and they're adapted by having thick succulent leaves to retain water, spines instead of leaves, and the spines have evolved from leaves to reduce surface area for water loss, as well as form a form of protection against being eaten by other predators looking for more water. But in desert regions you might often find camels, and camels are again very well adapted for living in hot, dry conditions. They have a hump on their back which is a store of fat and water to enable them to survive in the dry areas over long distances. Their feet spread out when they hit the sand so as to disperse their weight, they don't sink in the sand, and other such adaptations. Talked about cacti already. Plants are also very well adapted as well. In many cases they've been even more cleverly adapted than animals may be. And it's not exclusive to cacti living in hot climates and hot dry climates either. If we go into the jungle rainforest floor, we will see that there are big broad leaves. And again we've got to give consideration to the sorts of things that plants might be competing for. So plants obviously require light for photosynthesis, they require carbon dioxide, and they require the nutrients and minerals coming up through the roots from the soil. So in the rainforest there's an awful lot of competition. There's a big thick canopy of lots of other trees blocking out the light, so those on the jungle floor, it's very hard for them to get any light. So the bigger, broader leaves, big surface area, gives more chlorophyll, gives more chance for capturing light for photosynthesis. They will have a shallow root network that spreads very wide, trying to capture as much water and minerals as possibly can. So don't just think that adaptations are exclusive to the desert regions. If we go to other dry climates, not just the desert, maybe sea shores, sandy shores, sand dunes, things like that, we'll find this sort of a grass, specialist grass called the marram grass. So not only has it got a very small surface area to its leaves, you can see these small thin blade-like leaves, but if we look at the end-on view, a cross-sectional view of the end of one, if we cut it along its end and look that way, it would look like this. It's got a curved, rolled nature to it. The outside is a thick waxy layer to prevent water loss, but inside it's highly folded to increase the surface area for uptake of CO2, but also each of these folds has got tiny, tiny little hairs on it. and these hairs trap any moisture that is given out. So the evaporation of water from the leaf as part of its living processes of respiring, water being the main waste, one of the waste products, it will trap those water droplets in the hairs, therefore decreasing the surface area and therefore the concentration gradient across which the water might diffuse and therefore evaporate. So it's very important for this leaf to retain any water because it lives in such dry conditions. So you could quite easily be given any particular adaptation of any or any organism and asked to identify the adaptations that it has. And crucially, the marks that they always give you are not just for identifying each adaptation, and describing what that is. So, for example, a large surface area to the leaf by being broad, but you need to also explain how that helps the organism. So, for example, we might say that this plant here has a very broad leaf, as we said before, but that is to enable more light capture by having more chlorophyll in that broad leaf. So check the number of marks in each question and make sure that if it asks for 2 adaptations but gives you 4 marks, you not only describe the adaptation, but you also explain how that adaptation actually helps it obtain the nutrients and goals that it is trying to achieve. You can only have a look at this and try and think for yourself as to a few examples of key adaptations suitable for the fish living in its environment. So what sort of things do the living organisms compete for? And they are fairly generic across all organisms. If they're going to survive, they need to compete for space to live in, whether that be a lion and its pride having its territory, or whether it be a plant growing on the forest floor. It's still got to compete for somewhere to live. It has to obtain food, so animals will go and hunt their food and eat it, or they will be competing for the grasses and plants if they're herbivores. But similarly, plants won't necessarily compete for food, but they are competing for the sunlight to make their food through photosynthesis, and the nutrients in the soil and minerals, etc. And water is an essential element for all life to exist, and therefore they're going to be competing for that. So examples might be, as we've said, the camels or any other animal for that matter living on land is not going to want any other organisms coming to live, so it might try and see it off. Similarly, there may be predators all competing for space. So a lion is obviously going to be seeking its food. It may well eat these small animals that are here, these smaller mammals. Therefore, there's competition between the animals, the small ones to survive, the big ones to get their food, and also for space, etc. as well. So there's lots of different competitive interactions that take place altogether. Some specialist adaptations are often found in organisms that have been around for a very, very long time. We know that microorganisms have been on the planet the longest, in terms of evolutionary terms, and therefore with their way in which they reproduce by asexual reproduction, the chances of mutation are much, much greater, primarily because they have such simple genetic material. And what we find is that they are able to go against some of the rules of biological molecules that we've often learnt about. We've typically said that biological enzymes that carry out chemical reactions function best at 37 to 40 degrees C. What we find is that some microorganisms are able to tolerate exceptionally high temperatures. So they might be able to live in thermal vents deep in oceanic plates, or they live in volcanic springs and other hot springs. And in these places where perhaps there are volcanic eruptions, etc., coming out of the Earth's surface, temperatures can often exceed hundreds of degrees Celsius. Now clearly any normal living organism's enzymes would be chance of survival by carrying out respiration, etc. These are very well adapted to enable them to survive there, and it enables the enzymes to carry out their chemical reactions and be more tolerant to heat. And like any adaptation, if the adaptation makes them most suitable to their environment, then they're able to survive and they're able to go on and reproduce, thus passing on their genes, those successful genes, to their future generations. Any changes to those genes that happen to be beneficial may then be further passed on to their offspring as well, and that's the nature of evolution as well, which is the subject of another topic. But those are specific examples found in bacteria, other microorganisms, of key adaptations for survival in extreme conditions. And those organisms that can survive in these extreme conditions are known as extremophiles. Other examples may not just include temperature, but they might include maybe extreme pHs, or maybe salinity, salt levels, and other such areas that you might get, again associated with hot springs, or volcanic areas with lots of sulphur, things like that. There are a number of different types of adaptations that we can associate with living organisms. We've talked quite a bit about structural ones, which might be a particular surface area, the size of a leaf, or the organism's body, or perhaps it might be the fur on an organism, or something like that. We've spent a bit of time, they're the classic ones. We also need to consider other types that are not necessarily visual to the eye. Behavioural is the next example of those. We've found that organisms migrate to different parts of the globe depending on the seasons. They've obviously learned to do that to either avoid the cold or to go and find better food that's more available at that time of year. Again, don't forget, you need to describe why that behavioural process may be a benefit. Perhaps hibernation is another one, because to avoid times of the year when there is minimal food around or the temperatures are too cold, those sorts of things. So behavioural is another example of that sort of thing. And also functional, and we mentioned a bit about this already. Functional adaptations are about ones where cellular processes or the way in which things happen is different. An example of this might be the enzymes that are found in bacteria, those extremophiles. So, e.g. extremophiles. So anything to do with the way in which the organisms physically carry things out. Other examples may be specific ways in which reproduction cycles or systems have modified between the organisms that we're concerned with. So when you're given a question in an exam, don't just look for the obvious physical structural adaptations necessarily. Look at the information that they give with the description of the question and consider behavioural or even functional adaptations that they may have indicated to you.